Poštovani gospodine Suver,
Dear Mr. Suver, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. First of all, I would like to thank Mr. Suver for the invitation to participate in this important event. I would like to use this opportunity to congratulate this significant jubilee, 40 years of Marmara Foundation, which is recognized as a constituent part of the recent Turkish but our common history. And it is an additional pleasure for me because Mr. Suver has been a respected honorary consul of Montenegro for almost 2 decades. The topic of our panel is Peaceful Solutions Restoring Peace, and it is unfortunately the question is whether the road they have or the worse, if it even wants to find an answer to that question. 80 years today since the defeat of fascism. On 8th of May 1945 at 23:01 Middle European time, the Field Marshal signed in Berlin Nazi Germany, which was then confirmed by the Soviet Marshal Georgy Zhukov and British Marshal Arthur Tedder. Due to the difference in time in Moscow, this victory is celebrated a day later. At the same time, Europe celebrates its day to honor the memory of the day when 75 years ago, which is another jubilee, the Robert Schuman Declaration was adopted, which laid the foundation for creation of European Economic Community and European Union. Mentioning these days, I cannot but remind also the fact that Montenegro nation that I belong to raised the first general people's armed uprising against fascism in Europe. It was on 13 July 1941, and the famous French and global intellectual Jean-Paul Sartre said that it actually set the direction that the entire humanity was to take. In late 1980s, the several decades-long Cold War ended. The Berlin Wall collapsed, Germany reunited, USSR and Czechoslovakia disappeared, while Yugoslavia fell apart in the first wars in Europe after the Second World War. The world order that had existed by that time collapsed, and Europe and the democratic world got a new hope. Transatlantism flourished. European Economic Community grew into the EU that opened its door and accepted into its membership the Eastern European countries that were under the influence of Moscow before that time, as well as 2 former Yugoslav republics. The relations between Russia and the West relaxed. Well, why didn't this idyll last longer, but less than 3 decades? I mean, today, the relations between East and West are such that the topic of whether, when, and how the nuclear weapons will be used became legitimate, and rightfully so. At the same time, the relations between Euro-Atlantic partners sometimes look like the relations of fierce enemies. International order that was so thoughtfully designed based on a vision after the Second World War does not exist anymore. Multilateralism is thought to be completely redundant, and the United Nations are being mentioned only as a burden. International law is broken, not by unimportant ones, but by the most important countries, even by some of the permanent members of the Security Council. Political atmosphere in the democratic world is such that people whisper when they talk about democracy and the rule of law. The right to be described as civic is now given to the political practice where democracy and institutional order are considered to be obstacles to development, while autocratic models of rule are emphasized as examples of efficiency and success. The topic of defense and affirmation of values, starting with anti-fascism, is rarely mentioned. And even when it is mentioned, it is subject to ridicule, or even more frequently to criticism, because the person who speaks about these supposedly unimportant topics allegedly causes divisions in the society. Business has become a dominant guiding idea. Large capital interests are very fast in suppressing democracy. European democracy, even in the countries with the longest democratic tradition, is subject to reproaching and arrogant judgments by political dilettantes, only because they have significant positions on the Forbes list. Consequently, serious people avoid politics, leaving thus the room for the continuation of the sharp decline in the quality of geopolitics and politics in general. The Cold War geopolitical model withdrew in 1990s before the monopoly of one superpower. It seems that this monopoly will last less than the previous one. But have we seriously asked ourselves if the problem does not lay precisely in the monopoly that, as in trade and in economy, brings high risks? And it turns out, in the end, that the risks are the highest for the monopolist himself. In this nightmare around us, are we at all capable to providing answers to the most urgent crisis situations, and let alone to deal with the need to work in the laboratories of geopolitical wisdom on defining a long-term vision of peaceful and harmonious development of the world, so that the generations to come can be left a planet as a safer and happier place? Today, we have the largest conflict in Europe, war conflict, happening between Russia and Ukraine, whose nations were fighting together in the fight against fascism and gave a decisive contribution to this glorious victory that we celebrate today. We cannot see the end of that conflict that has entered its fourth year. At the same time, we have the war in Gaza, and we are horrified to see the army of the state, whose people suffered the most in the Second World War, in their unavoidable fight against the terrorist organization. Hamas is killing for 2 years hundreds and thousands of Palestinian civilians, mostly children and women. These developments that I regions as although after the 90s, the common goal of all our countries was to integrate into EU, and almost all of the countries wanted to integrate in NATO. I am afraid that 30 years later, we are closer to the condition of the tragic 1990s than to Brussels. Of course, responsibility for the missed opportunities and for one's own destiny primarily lies on the one who does not recognize the offered opportunity or who does it responsibly. So we in the Western Balkans are primarily responsible. However, the EU is not much less responsible. They took too long to contemplate if their priority was to focus on itself and its internal problems, or to be led by a serious geopolitical need to complete the process of uniting Europe. It turned out that this indecisiveness was very destructively abused by the key enemy of the European Union, the regime in Moscow, and that it successfully devastated the most important heritage of the pro-European development of Western Balkan societies, from the fragile, only announced system of European values to the hope in the realistically foreseeable European future. If we add to that more than obvious mistakes of the most important actors of the Western politics in our region in the last couple of years, we should not be surprised by the situation. Because the devastating, violent, genocidal Balkan nationalisms are on the rise again. In the geopolitical chaos and demonstration of violence on the international scene, they recognize the new chance to achieve their retrograde goals of 1990s that cost our nations more than 1,500,000 human lives. It is certainly that they will not succeed in changing the borders and in extending the areas of one national and mono-religious self-sufficiency, but they will waste our time again, and we might miss another opportunity. And in the end, let me say in conclusion that we need to use this platform to send an alarming call for a responsible geopolitical dialogue, because from this level of politics, either solutions or impulses for new chaos are generated. The world needs political normalcy, and politics as a field needs seriousness, responsibility and dignity that it used to have until recently. Violence and imposed solutions by the great and the powerful is not and cannot be an alternative to response to agreement and inclusive responsibility of all for peace and development in the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, dear President.